Hello and welcome to Planet Outlook. In this episode, we are going to look at trees and our special relationship with them. And my guest today is Dr. Harini Nagendra, acclaimed author, ecologist, and professor of sustainability at the Azim Premji University in Bengaluru. Thank you, Harini, for joining us on Planet Outlook. So, two of your recent books, which came after one by one, talked about nature in the city,
Right.
our green spaces. So in this lockdown, we've seen a lot of people connecting back to nature, but it's more on birds, more on animals, but we haven't seen that kind of enthusiasm on trees and plants around us.
Hmm.
So give us a sense of how it began, the nature in the city, your book, and the next book also, Cities and Canopies, Trees in Our Cities.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. And to talk about this because it is one of my favorite topics. I'm an ecologist, as you know, who's been working on India's forests and cities for now close to 20 years. And for a long time, like all ecologists, or let's say most ecologists in India, the fascination was for distant forests in distant places. But I'm also from Bangalore. So in 2003, I moved back to Bangalore after some years outside in the US and was struck by a number of changes, post liberalization, lots of roads, IT companies, and therefore a lot of changes in terms of nature. And sometime by the late 90s and by about 2003-4, there was the beginnings of what is now a rampant felling of trees across Bangalore. So across the city, trees are being, I think, at least lakhs and lakhs of trees. We don't have a good count. That is the problem. But this was starting in 2003, 4, 5. And I was trying to figure out how many trees, very simple things, how many trees have been cut, what is the impact on the city. So that, when activist groups are trying to petition for change, or you're just talking to a regular citizen and telling them why it's important, how do you understand this? And then I realized that ecology or nature in the city slips through cracks because ecologists are very rarely interested in cities because that's where people are and they would prefer places that are fair enough. I mean, most people would prefer to study nature in an isolated spot, go trekking in a forest. Cities, there are a number of very excellent pieces of research or lovely books on cities, but it pretends as though nature doesn't shape the culture of the city. And we know that Delhi is shaped by the culture of either old Delhi, or the culture of Lutyens. Delhi is shaped by its parks. Similarly, Bangalore by its tree-lined avenues, Kolkata by the East Kolkata wetlands and its trees on streets. So we know our cities are completely shaped, the culture, the street life, etc., shaped by trees and lakes and other aspects of nature. So I started studying this from that aspect. And I actually didn't start studying it as a scientist. So at that time, I was planning for it to be a very small part of my research career. I said, okay, I'm going to do work which is useful to governments, useful to citizen groups working on lake restoration, useful to activist groups. Over time, it's become sort of an obsession and taken over now 90% of my research career. So with that said, I think this ecology research of mine in cities is a very different piece of research for me because I'm not thinking like a typical scientist in that sense, or the way I thought myself of other places. Thinking like a mother of a small child, it's thinking of her growing up in the city. Thinking of myself as the resident of a city, it's been my city for most of my childhood and adult life. So over 50 years of change, how do you see changes in the city? Is this the city that I grew up in, or is it the kind of city that people can feel a comfortable life in? So with that, about 2016, 2014 to 16 is when I wrote the first book, which is Nature in the City. And I was writing it with the objective of sharing all the research we had done. By then, we had a long-term program of research in Bangalore, working on nature in different aspects, in slums, in parks, on streets, the way people relate to nature.
So what were the key finds? Yeah.
Yeah, so in one of the very key findings was that history plays a huge role in the evolution of human nature relationships. And we have to take a long view. So you talk to anybody about cities and nature normally, unless they're tree enthusiasts or nature enthusiasts, the first thing they will say is, the city is not a place for nature. Nature is something outside. You go to a distant park or on a weekend, and in the city, you just need roads and infrastructure. That's what we should focus on. What you find in Bangalore is it's a city that grew because of people's attention to nature. So over 1,500 years before it was a city, when it was an unpopulated area in a semi-dry context, no large rivers, no trees, very hot, very barren landscape. People came in and dug lakes or tanks, created these water bodies. They planted trees both for livelihoods and for shade, and actually greened the city and made it a much more water rich city. And so till I'd say the 1850s, Bangalore grew because of the attention we paid to ecology. In about 150, 170 years, we destroyed that relationship. So it's only in the last 150 years that the city grew at the expense of ecology. So I think that's the first and for me the most important lesson, that cities will grow only if you protect the ecology. Otherwise, you get the dystopic context that you have where people say Bangalore is running out of water. 15 years later, will the city survive? Do you have to leave it like a Tughlakabad and move somewhere else? Those kinds of questions.
But why this neglect? See, trees have been sacred to us as a culture. It's been always there in
Right.
folklore, and it's part of our kind of ethos
Yeah.
kind of thing. So where do you see the disconnect happening? Because also the Chipko movement, which is India's
Mhm.
premier environmental movement, is all about trees. So where has, when and where kind of has human
So
society disconnected kind of?
to me, a lot of the disconnect happens when our consumption patterns start going outside of cities. So in Bangalore, you can clearly see this. Lakes and wells and ponds and tanks were sacred, well maintained, worshipped, and just something that you depended on for daily survival. The moment piped water comes into Bangalore in the 1890s, you see this relationship break down. In a matter of 3, 4, 5 years, it's broken down. So if instead of getting piped water completely to all the city from distant rivers or lakes, if we had said, okay, 90% of the city continues to depend on internal water supply, and 10% which is we'll supplement. We didn't do that. Similarly, now you see the periphery of Bangalore is very particular. There's so much of community-based lake restoration in the periphery because this is the place where groundwater dependent supply and tanker prices have increased in the past 10 years. They've gone up 3 times, for instance. So people are very careful and they know that they need water. However, now we're getting Kaveri water to the periphery of the city only once a week, but already you can see that people have stopped thinking about the importance of lakes. They say, okay, Kaveri to aa raha hai pani, why would I need anything else? So to me, similarly with trees, trees that we planted in Bangalore, like most parts of India, were tamarind and jackfruit and pongamia and all these trees that you use every day. Cows graze under certain kinds of trees.
This you mentioned in your next book, basically, the cities and
This also
canopies.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So in that sense, once we lose that attachment to trees and they're only becoming recreational, or a lake is a place you go for a walk, with your family, then you don't need it every day. You might go for a walk once a week, you might go for a walk once a month. So you lose that connection. That brought me, so the Nature in the City was written to talk to people about in Bangalore about how important their city is. And it was a book based a lot on our own primary research. But I found two things with that. One is that people from other cities were also very keen. Why don't you write a book on Delhi? Why don't you write a book on Mumbai? And you can't simply write a whole series of books on each of Indian cities, right? But the second thing also was that people who read it were people who are readers. But what happens to all the people who like to engage with trees in other ways? Some people cook. They love to cook with different kinds of trees. Some people smell and touch trees, and some people climb trees. Some people play games with seed parts and flowers, and or write poems about trees or stories to trees. So Cities and Canopies was with my friend and colleague Seema, and we've been thinking for a lot about our own childhood experiences. You do research on trees, but you engage with them in multi-sensory ways. So how do you write a book which actually integrates all of this? So we have recipes, we have riddles, we have poems, we have games, we have all these kinds of things. And we found that really takes the book beyond the regular reader who is interested in scholarly books, but to the wider audience who is very interested in trees in all aspects. So that was our
But
focus.
there's a huge loss in terms of the older trees of Bangalore. But
Right.
also in urban planning, there is also a lot of focus on replanting kind of thing. But
Hmm.
but where you have questioned that there's a lot of ornamental trees kind of
Hmm.
coming in, which has much lesser use or has a disconnect with our kind of society than our old traditional, the native trees. So for the viewers, a lot of viewers watching this looks at trees as kind of a homogeneous, like tree species as
Right.
trees kind of
Exactly.
thing.
Yes. Yes.
So they
Yes.
do not understand native trees and the ornamental
Right.
trees or invasive species. So if you can just tell our viewers a bit of this.
A tree is not the same as another tree, as you point out, right? So a eucalyptus tree, for instance, is extremely water hungry. Similarly, so is a coconut and many of our ornamental palms. So if you think of the royal palm that we see planted in so many of these ornamental IT landscapes, they suck up a lot of water. Similarly, some trees like the ficus species, banyan and peepal, are indigenous trees. They've been local for a long time and they fruit through the year. So they are, even in a city where you have very few trees, this will help birds and butterflies and squirrels and lorises and all kinds of, from the very common to the very rare species survive because they're fruiting through the year. Similarly, something like tamarind or jamun or jackfruit is something that people gorge on, but also so do animals. So there's a lot of difference. Now, if you look at the kinds of trees that Bangalore used to plant on its highways, it's like Delhi used to plant or Mumbai, the jamun and the tamarind and the banyan trees. And there's a slight difference there. There people often say native tree species should be planted, but it's not just native. Some tamarind has been brought to India thousands of years ago, so I could say it's almost native. It's not. It's been around for long enough. The rain tree has been in Bangalore for 150 years. So many species are sort of adapted to it.
Like the
However,
Gulmohar also,
like
but
the
it's an
gulmohar.
ornamental.
The gulmohar is ornamental. The gulmohar is not very good for planting because it's got very shallow roots. So in one storm, it falls. Similarly, the copper pod is also brought 150 years ago, but it's bad for the city because they're very weak roots. So you need to think of trees and trees, exactly like you said. What trees do you plant? If you look at the current situation in Bangalore, the administrators will tell you that they are not planting fruiting trees anywhere. They are planting trees like neem and pongamia and ornamental species like tebibuia because they say people will fight over the trees. Now that sort of tells you to me a very telling thing of our urban mindset. Huh? You don't want anything that is useful because people will fight over it. But people have always learned how to cooperate and share produce of trees. So these are very sort of, to me, it's a trees used to be part of our social fabric, not just our ecological fabric. But this kind of way of thinking of a tree as an ornamental, decorative thing stops that.
Also, plants also. More and more ornamental plants are coming in. So there is now no regard for a banyan or no regard for a
Yeah.
peepal tree, which are very sacred to our country. They are getting chopped down. There is no hue and cry. So there's a lot of hue and cry when a tiger dies, but I don't see that
Right.
same amount of hue and cry on a banyan or a people, which are kind of heavily connected to our kind of religious kind of. So, so where do you see this? Because urban planning is also a lot about trees, a lot about horticulture kind of thing. But we have shifted from our kind of traditional ethos where we planted, as you have said, by the roadside, banyan for
Mm.
shade, for fruiting, and all those things. But how do you see these things? There's a very technocratic approach to
Right.
now when it comes to tree planting or
Right.
kind of designing an urban space.
Mhm. So that's very true. If you again look at the kinds of plants we plant in our parks, we did a study and we found that 80% of all the species planted in parks are exotic and typically ornamental. Whereas if you look at slums, people will plant what is useful. Useful means something that is either used for medicine or for worship or which they use as a face pack or for food or something like that, which typically means it's a native species because they know the use of it. So 80% of the trees and plants in slums are native, whereas 80% of the plants in uh, parks are the opposite. It's exotic. So you see how the entire balance shifts, and who's planting them in the parks and on the streets? The horticultural is, as you say, and that is the technocratic approach. I mean, look at our urban planting targets. No, you will see money spent every year. Look at any city budget on beautification of parks and beautification of lakes. That word is a very telling word. Beautification includes a lot of cement and concrete in the budget and a few ornamental plants that you put in. But a banyan tree, for instance, it's beautiful, or a mango. You don't really need a fancy playground. If you have an old traditional variety of mango with its low spreading branches, kids will climb the mango. Or if you have a banyan tree, kids will climb the banyan tree. So you have to think that way. The technocratic vision, as you said, does not allow for that.
But also people, also the society thinks that planting trees, just trees of any kind will solve the environmental problem. How and where did this kind of notion kind of now have been transfixed into the society that if you plant trees, will solve all the environmental issues?
So we did a study some years ago, and we looked at just a set of streets in Bangalore, busy streets. And what you can do is you could do air pollution. So we did air pollution assessments for 8 hours in the same day on two stretches of the road, one with tree cover, one without tree cover. So the traffic is the same, the wind conditions are the same, everything else. It's the same stretch of road. And you find that, so several things. One is the suspended particulate matter, the soot that you find, which is really damaging to the lungs, right? So you can take an air filter and suck air through it for 8 hours. At the end of the day, I mean, we did our tests, but the air filter without trees is black. And that is, you can imagine what our lungs look like. And the other air filter is light gray when you have the trees. So suspended particulate matter levels reduce by 75% if you have trees. And similarly, sulfur dioxide, the various nitrous oxides, carbon monoxide, all of this reduces when you have trees. Part of it is that the pores take up the trees, these sulfur dioxide and the nitrous oxides. But the other part of it is that if you look at many of these leaves have minute hairs. So typically the trees that are more effective at reducing air pollution are the ones with these minute hairs because they trap a lot of the soot. That said, a lot of these trees also emit a lot of volatile organic compounds. So it depends on which species. Some trees can actually make your air pollution much worse because volatile organic compounds react with things like nitrous oxides and can actually give you breathing disorders. So you have to be careful. As you said, it's not a silver bullet.
So which are the trees which are harmful?
We don't really have enough information. Eucalyptus is, for instance, often thought of as being one of these trees because it has a lot of volatile organic compounds. So it could be one of the trees that is not a very healthy tree to plant in many urban environments, especially when you have this dangerous mix of traffic-based exhaust fumes and the trees. But frankly, there is not enough research. This is all still guesswork.
And the other issue of just if you plant trees, you solve climate change, which is again a kind of a little misnomer.
Yes. To me, that's one of the, I think, the biggest disservices that climate crisis focus is doing. You know, we do have a climate crisis and we need to look at it, but we need to look at the climate as connected to biodiversity, as connected to health, as connected to all of the other situations that plague our daily life today. And when you focus only on carbon emissions, you focus only on tree plantation. But it's the ecology of the city or the ecology of ecosystems that we need to reduce, to restore. Right? If you think of thriving ecosystems which are functional, that's when they will take care of all your other things, cleaning the water, cleaning the air, etc. Just planting trees is not, it can often be ruinous. If you have a wetland, for instance, like let's say you plant trees in the Yamuna riverbed, as some religious organizations are trying to do, and you're taking that riverbed and converting it into a plantation to suck out all the water.
I was about to come to that because also there is this lot of government programs which are planting trees in areas where the trees was not supposed to be there, like grasslands, just like
Yes.
you said, riverbeds. So are you really concerned on this whole trend of planting trees everywhere?
I'm very concerned for two reasons. One is the ecological reason that you so rightly mentioned. You know, if you plant trees in the Great Indian Bustard's grassland habitat, for instance, you are endangering the Great Indian Bustard. Similarly, in Hesarghatta Lake in Bangalore, they have planted trees. So any very aggressive focus on planting trees across India, we have seen this with social forestry in India, where they planted teak and eucalyptus and acacia auriculiformis across India, is quite devastating ecologically. But the second factor is also the social factor. If you take away village commons or areas owned by tribal communities or areas farmed by Dalit communities, and you take them as land grabs for either corporate sponsored plantations or state sponsored plantations, and that's happening across the country in a number of places now, that's very bad socially also. So you need to work on the social and the ecological aspects of this tree planting in a very careful manner. It can be done and can be very helpful, but you shouldn't go overboard. And as you say, a tree is not a tree. You need to know the right trees to plant in the right places.
But the government, I'm just not saying the current government, but for years,
Mm.
all our governments have the set targets that we have to increase tree cover. Also, the way we kind of map our forest, what the forest research does, is very controversial kind of thing. It's a mathematical model that 10 hectares and all those things. So, how do you see we can bring in a change in the bureaucratic mindset, in the government policy, that it is just not about increasing tree cover, but doing the right things at the right places?
I think so. There has to be some kind of collaboration between the bureaucrats who are often thinking as a forester thinks in terms of just timber and growth and carbon and volume, and local communities who are often quite knowledgeable about their trees. So you have to have a decentralized way of looking at it, and with good ecologists on board, so that combination of somebody who knows what do they want socially from their trees. Many communities will plant certain fruiting species, for instance, so food forests. It's now a fashionable label to call them food forests, but that's what community forests were all along, except it was also food for the cow and food for the goat as well as food for human beings, right? So planting those kinds of trees on their forest land, and typically again there would be trees that did not need lot of water. So you have to get away from this kind of purely bureaucrat driven problem and make it much more inclusive, and make it also, I think, flexible. Work with targets perhaps, but those targets should be adaptable to the ground context. And the second thing we don't have in any of these targets is preserving our heritage trees. Where do we have a countrywide system? There's incentive for planting trees, but what about maintaining a 150-year-old tree? It's going to give you services that no other tree can give you, even from the carbon point of view.
Does transplanting work, and should we also focus on transplanting in a big way?
So yes and no, according to me. Transplanting is useful. I've seen it done now widely in multiple cities and talked to a number of people who are working with transplantation in Hyderabad, Delhi, Bangalore, other places. The thing is, it's very useful when your trees are going to go anyway. But it only works with certain kinds of species. Ficus is a good example. Even if you have 80-year-old ficus species, you can transplant them reasonably successfully. But from a carbon point of view, you're still losing the root cover, all the soil that was done, because you have to chop the roots somewhere. And very old trees, most of this soil carbon sequestration is actually underground. It's much more than the trunk holds. The second thing is that the growth of the tree is undeniably impacted. So you are not going to have as healthy and thriving a tree. So ideally, to me, what you should do first is, if you want to do road widening, then try and keep the trees in the median of the road and widen on the other side of the road. If you can't do that, only then try and change the alignments in some ways, because sometimes you can change the alignments to avoid these heritage trees. And only if that is not possible, as a last resort, you should be doing the transplantation, because all your trees will not, maybe 30% can be transplanted.
So now I want to shift to another topic. As an ecologist, we would love to hear on this, is how trees connect with each other. So there are a number of books, starting from one of my favorites is The Secret Life of Plants by Peter Tompkinson and Christopher Bird, which shows that trees are also kind of have a social system. They interact, connect, just like us. And a lot of us don't actually recognize it, kind of thing. And as an ecologist, if you can tell that story.
Sure. So there have been a lot of interesting things, the pieces of research that suggest that trees talk to each other. To me, one of the most fascinating parts is how they talk underground. Overground, we know that trees send chemical signals in the air. So if one tree is being eaten by an insect, it might send certain chemicals which signal the other trees around that insects are around, you could get infected by a pest attack. So all trees in that area of that species will ramp up some poisonous chemical production in their leaves so that the insects find them unpalatable. There are even more fascinating things that go on underground. So what these many now researchers have found is that trees in most forests are linked by these underground networks of mycelia, types of fungi, and they provide food, as takes food from one tree to another. So for instance, if you look at a deciduous forest in let's say Canada, so there are certain trees that produce a lot of food in the summer. They will send that food and share it with certain other trees that are not producing as much food in the summer, and in the winter the other species repays that favor. So they found 500-year-old mother trees which are just stumps. They've been cut down 300-400 years ago, and they're still being kept alive. The stump of the tree, no leaves, no twigs, no branches, but it's thriving because it's being fed by these underground mycelia. Why would other trees take so much effort to keep a mother tree or a heritage tree alive? We don't know. But clearly, that tree is somehow important to that ecosystem. Otherwise, why would that entire funneling of food and energy be going on? So that also I keep thinking then, if you're chopping down these heritage trees here, what impact is it doing on the entire ecosystem and that society of trees around it? Do they feel that they've lost a heritage tree? And, is there something going on there that we've not studied that?
How do you study such a invisible phenomenon?
So you have to have different ways of looking at it. You can take cores into the soil and look at fungal mycelial networks, but you can also trace these. You can put let's say you put sugar or certain things, you can tag them with certain radioactive minerals or certain other colors, and see which ones show up in which sap. So if it's moving between species, you can track them. So it's a long and painstaking research, but it can be done. It's just not been done in the Indian context.
And what happens when an invasive species is planted?
That's another fascinating question. We really don't know. I mean, there's so much that we don't know in this context. What happens true when an invasive species, the problem is an invasive species to me will come, but without its fungus. It will just come as a tree. And so it will not be able to participate in this network. So it's like an invasive species comes often, it becomes invasive because the pests that attack it and keep it under control in its native system have not come along with it. So it's probably going to be the same thing, but we should, there is a lot of scope for so many master students and PhD students to do all this kind of work.
Your main work is in Bangalore, but also you have seen kind of the urbanscape in Delhi or Bombay kind of thing. So in Delhi, for example, Delhi, I noticed a change of weather. So I came in the mid 90s from Calcutta, and those days Delhi was very dry as a weather system. Today, it's become very humid. Right now, monsoon, or just around the monsoon, it becomes very humid. So that was not the character of Delhi's. So there is some people think that this has happened because Delhi's greenery has increased or something. I don't know the figures. I'm very skeptical about these numbers. So do you think there is a localized change of weather in this short period of time, say 20, 25 years? Such things can happen?
It can happen. Whether Delhi's tree cover has increased so much in 30 years, that I don't know. That I'm little skeptical about to the extent to actually impact this. But definitely trees. Again, in our studies, you can see the humidity levels are far higher when you are below trees. So in fact, in South India, there is some debate when, let's say, climate change goes up and you get a lot of heat waves come in the future. Should you plant trees to keep people safe from heat waves, or should you not plant trees? Because you will reduce heat, but you will increase humidity. And heat and humidity, both, if they are high, that's when people are much more susceptible to climate change effects. So in the Delhi context, I'm really not sure. It is possible, but how many trees have really been planted in Delhi?
So what is your advice to a lot of young people who's watching this, and those who think planting trees or saving trees will help the cause of environment?
So I'd say firstly, get to know your trees. Many people don't know the difference between a eucalyptus and some other local tree. I get to know the trees in whichever city that you are in, and get to become sort of friends with them. See when they flower, when they fruit, what kinds of produce they have, who sits under the tree, what do street vendors do. Street vendors are a great source of information about trees. So that's the first thing. Just be curious. I think go outside and see things. Second thing is somehow try and start a neighborhood society or a group, because to me, finally, India cities, the hope is our communities. Government will not act unless we make them act, because the government is really typically in most cities as interested in road widening and infrastructure projects. They will only listen when citizens protest. And why would citizens protest unless you care about your trees? So create that structure, create little interest groups, go butterfly watching, tree watching, those kinds of things.
How does kind of, see, even in a World Environment Day or any kind of a similar kind of function, there's a lot of saplings which are coming in. So there is a lot of this horticulture market which is developed, even for indoor plants, because of the air pollution factor. Are we going in a right direction? I just want to ask basically, there's a lot of money plants coming in, there's a lot of mother-in-law tongues coming into the house. So is this also a good practice, or there has to be checks and balances?
There have to be checks and balances. If you actually do the research, the numbers of plants that you need to really make any appreciable effect on reducing indoor air pollution, we can't have. We'll be sitting surrounded by plants. So you need, I forget the numbers, but you would need in a normal sized bedroom, for instance, something like 25 or 30 plants. We simply can't live with that kind of shrubbery in our house. So I think these are all fads. It's much better off planting a number of trees around you on your streets and trying to figure out how to make your community more resilient from tree planting. And for those to plant the right kinds of species. But yeah, World Environment Day to me is a farce, because nobody thinks what happens to the trees you plant beyond the World Environment Day, right? Every corporate will plant 1,000 trees and then leave them and go away.
Yeah, it's the next day it's chewed by goats or cows, nobody knows.
Exactly.
But So the thing is, there has to be a kind of regular interaction between the civil society and urban
Hmm.
planners.
Hmm.
How how will that happen, kind of thing? So there are large gaps because urban planning happens way kind of ahead, and the
Yes,
civil society is also not aware when the blueprint
absolutely.
is drawn, kind of thing. So how are or how or where can these gaps be kind of closed down?
See, two things. One is every city needs a tree policy. And note, very few cities actually have this. So it is actually recommended if you look at the Municipal Tree Act. But for instance, what trees should you plant? Or in large spaces, what species should you plant? In small corners, what species do you plant? What roots will are good with plumbing lines? What kinds of canopies go well with electricity lines? Simple things, whatever is what is water hungry, what will survive in a hot place versus a cool place. So that kind of a tree policy, so many people come to us in Bangalore and say, what should I plant for my apartment? So we are actually developing a booklet for Bangalore saying, what should you plant? Similarly, there need to be booklets for each place, and that civil society and naturalists and enthusiasts can really do a good job there. But the second problem that you're saying is there needs to be engagement with the bureaucrats. So typical tree, as you're saying, typical road widening in Bangalore, you will know that there is a metro line, and you can either obstruct the metro line or approve the metro line. But if you could negotiate with them before and say, can you realign it? Can you go underground here and save the heritage trees? That is the negotiation that even within the bureaucracy, they don't have. So in Bangalore, for instance, the engineering department and the roads department will draw up these plans, then come to the forest wing and say, give us clearance. So forest wing itself has been telling us that if they worked with us before, we could have suggested some ways to preserve trees. But either we have to give carte blanche permissions or be told that we are anti-development within the departments. So they don't even talk to each other, forget talking to civil society. So that has to be revamped from the start. How do you do that? Can you engage, for instance, with these planning authorities better? In some cases in Bangalore, there was a very good lake. With the first time that the BBMP, the municipality, came up with a lake department, that chief engineer in charge was very progressive. So he reached out to civic groups and said, help me, I will also help you. Come redesign the lake planning process from the start. So all the lakes that were restored during his particular tenure have been very well done because civic groups worked with him, ecologists worked with him, and before the tender went out, essentially, that's the time you have to intervene. It was really done in a way that was ecological and kept in community requirements. But that kind of process has to be institutionalized. Now that he's gone, we're back to square one.
Are you setting up one? Since you're in Bangalore, there's so much of interest in trees with your work. I don't know
Yeah.
what's your next project, but I hope. Well, tell us if you have something coming
So
coming
we
up
are
very.
doing so we're doing a few small things which essentially trying to get the idea of getting people more in touch with trees and plants around them. So we have for instance a little booklet that is coming out which is a little picture booklet. So there were gundathopes or these sacred forests, village forests, and they have been disappearing all over Bangalore as the city is engulfing them. So we have a little picture book, with sketches. It's a woman from the city who used to have a favorite tree, so she sits down in conversation with the tree. So it's a bilingual Kannada English book. We have the booklet that I was telling you about on what trees do you plant. You want to plant a tree, what should you plant and why, and give you a choice of trees. We have another, which is a very interesting one coming out about foraging of wild plants. And as across India, in the villages, even in the cities, people used to forage for these wild weeds and cook them for various medicinal uses as well as nutrition. That process is going. So we're trying to do a number of recipes and a number of plants based on research that we have done with about 200 women. Try to see so if we can popularize those again. What are the recipes? What are the plants? How do you identify them? So I feel like these are the little micro things that you need to do to get people tree blindness. I was talking to a Hyderabad tree activist, and he said he was tree blind before his marriage, and then he realized his wife knew the names of all species, and she was very surprised about how he could be tree blind. I think tree blindness afflicts so many people in cities, and or plant blindness more broadly. If we can fix that, we've fixed a lot of problems.
We mentioned sacred groves, so that's a very interesting thing, which is also kind of depleting very fast, though it's a
Mm.
more rural kind of phenomenon kind of thing. How scared are you this disappearing of sacred groves across the country as India turns more urban from rural?
So I am worried, but I also see, for instance, in Bangalore, we have a practice, and I think you call it probably Chautara in Delhi and a lot of the north. So it's a raised platform. You will have a people or a banyan next to a neem, and typically the trees are supposed to be married in a ceremony. So there is a neem and a people or a neem and a banyan. Those are still existing across Bangalore. In the heart of the city, you will find these places where people, it acts as a community node. And near my house in Sarjapur, for instance, there's a beautiful banyan tree, which people say is 350 years old. The highway was supposed to go through it, and people agitated, saying our sacred god is here, and the highway was diverted. So there's this, it's a huge, you walk into that, it's like a magical forest. It's just one tree, but it's still there, and it has actually been, the highway was diverted to avoid that tree. So to me, I'm still hopeful. In the heart of Cubbon Park, you will see these trees which are sacred, under which you'll see kites coming because the priest throws meat and feeds them. It's a vegetarian priest, but every Saturday he throws meat for the kites. So there's still that culture that is thriving across the city in these lovely places. And I think that spirit of sacredness to me is because people from all communities come. Huh? So you can have, diverse religions coming to worship at these trees. Yeah, is where the India's tradition of urban sacredness is going to continue.
Yeah, on that note, we'll end. Thank you so much for this fascinating kind of stories on trees. Great having you on this show, Harini. Thank you so
Likewise.
much.
Thank you, Ananda. This was a pleasure.